today. How
Wow,
did
that'll be wonderful. I wanted to just say that, please,
let me pick up the
we'll start with you.
okay. Indeed, we are in a very, very difficult time.
हम्म सो सविता जी से हम स्टार्ट करेंगे, देन अरविंद मिश्रा जी, उसके बाद आशुतोष जी, एंड देन धनंजय. That's the order.
Okay.
So I'll just talk a little bit about the book and I'll give it to Professor Thakur.
Okay. Oh, so
So
Manindra is
we'll
going to be
discussion.
Manindra is
Yeah,
going to be coordinating it. Oh, good.
yeah. He'll initiate the conversation, and then it'll just be very organic between all of you all and Professor Tindok.
Okay. Okay. She'll be there, no?
Yeah, she's there. She's going to be there.
Wonderful.
So you guys will have a conversation with her. This is like a platform where the reader and the writer interacts. That's why it's beyond the book. Because I really do believe that the writer writes it, but we, the reader, we finish the book because we interpret it in our own ways.
I know.
So a
If Meera is
conversation
there,
between.
then she will also she will know the richness of her work because we'll be speaking from different angles. It is indeed.
Absolutely. And if you think that something else should have been included, or what do you think should, which is so speaking about six fault lines, and there are so many more.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Yeah, let it keep it at the level of chatting. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. This
we'll be
has to be a
able to-
conversation. So
yeah,
you talk, and each one of you is getting 10 to 15 minutes. I think that should be all right.
yeah. I think I'm fine with 15.
Okay, great.
So let others join, and I'll
Yeah,
be
yeah.
back.
We'll
Okay?
begin at 11. We begin at 11, which is like still some time away.
Yeah.
And so we'll just wait for others to join in.
So I'm just going through her book. I haven't read the entire book as yet, but yeah, there is something to start with, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, I've joined. Can you hear me?
Good morning, ma'am.
Morning, you can hear me?
Yes, ma'am,
All
absolutely.
right, fine. We are connected and you can see me, right? Though it's.
Now we can see you, Professor Chuddo. Good morning.
Morning, Savita. How are you? Well, Savita can't hear you.
Please unmute yourself. Good morning, Professor Chandok.
Good
Oh,
morning.
hello, Manisha.
I'm good. How
Morning.
about you?
I'm
Can you hear
okay.
me?
I was, I joined from the WhatsApp and it said Taliban takeover. I said, this is not what I'm planning. So Gargi must have had a conference on Taliban takeover.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. How are you, Manisha? How's your little one?
Very well. Thank you.
Oh, good.
I think he's going to join us shortly.
You're going.
No, he's going to
Sorry.
join, because it's, he keeps hearing this conversation. Sometimes, he gets very curious and he wants to listen in. So probably he'll join in. Acha, he's
Yeah.
being exposed to good, he's listening to good things.
There he's, I think he's joined already, Manisha. Is he
Oh,
waving?
he downloaded Windows 11 for me yesterday. That he said, you do it on this, Mama. So we're waiting for a couple more of our panelists, Ashutosh ji and Dhananjay, and of course, our principal.
So good morning, Nira. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but the poster has to be on the screen. I'm not. Wait a minute. I'll go on to full screen. The poster is on. I'm viewing Mehreen's screen.
It is there on screen. I think the poster is there, ma'am.
So it's okay. All right. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't have to remove it. Okay.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
no.
Yeah, yeah. Hi, Savita, please.
Hi, hi. So how are you doing, Nira? You've
I'm
written a
fine.
wonderful
Thank
book.
you. I'm very well. How you tell me? You liked
I,
it? I'm so happy.
yes, yes. I will be, of course, talking about it. I don't want to give away my
I
important
thought the
lines.
literature and the poetry must
Yes.
be appealing to you.
Yeah. Manisha has requested me to read one or two poems
Yeah.
in honor of your book.
Sure. I'd be honored.
So I'll do that.
Yeah.
So Nira, my new book has come out.
Okay.
It's called Khoi Cheezon Ka Shok. Can you see?
Arey wah. Congratulations.
So
I think we can begin now. Principal ma'am is here, and Dhananjay is also joined. So we can start the proceedings formally.
Yeah, yeah. Ashutosh joined.
Ashutosh is going to be joining.
Ashutosh is probably
Let's
too
just
busy
begin. I think
following
we'll start with
Punjab
Savita.
developments. They're going to declare the chief ministerial candidate, so Ashutosh is probably following that.
So Neera ma'am, we're just going to begin.
Yeah. Tell me.
We can start.
Okay.
1 second. Yeah.
Yeah. As famously remarked by Gandhiji, death is at any time blessed, but it is twice blessed for a warrior who
Maitre, I
dies for
can't
his
really
cause.
hear you for some reason. Can you talk 1 minute?
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry,
sure.
sorry. I'm unable to shift this poster, so I don't know. I can only see you people
Let's just
in
leave
miniature.
it like that.
We'll
Yeah.
stop sharing the screen.
Okay. Well, okay. No, it's not responding. Anyway, it's okay. Tell me. Maitre?
Yes. As famously remarked by Gandhiji, death is at any time blessed, but it is twice blessed for a warrior who dies for his cause. That is truth. Good morning, everyone. Today we have gathered here to commemorate Martyr's Day, marking the 74th death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. The Department of Political Science, Gargi College, in collaboration with the Foundation for Creative Social Research, warmly welcomes you all to the book discussion under the aegis of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. The book, Violence in Our Bones, maps assorted kinds of violence in India, which is authored by renowned Professor Neera Chandok, former head of Political Science Department, Delhi University. We are delighted to have her here with us, along with the esteemed panelists Professor Ashutosh Kumar, Dr. Dhananjay Rai, Professor Savita Singh, Professor Arvind Mishra, our principal, Professor Pramila Kumar, Professor Manindranath Thakur, Chairperson of Foundation for Social Research, our teacher in charge, Dr. Manisha Roy, Association in charges, Dr. Devraj, and Dr. Seema Sharma, as well as other faculty members and my dear friends. I would urge everyone to keep their mics muted at all times. To proceed further, I would like to request our principal, Professor Pramila Kumar, to bestow her wisdom. Over to you, ma'am.
And Professor Maninder Nath Thakur, Chairman of the Founder for Creative Social Research, our academic partner for this event. Professor Neera Chandok, the author whose interesting book is the subject of discussion today, my fellow colleagues, dear participants, and my beloved students, good morning to all of you. I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this virtual book discussion on an exciting book titled The Violence in Our Bones, Mapping the Deadly Fault Lines in Indian Society. The event is organized by the Department of Political Science in collaboration with the Foundation for Creative Social Research under the aegis of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav to commemorate the 74th Martyr Day of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhiji was a staunch advocate of non-violence, and to honor his legacy, we must abjure violence in all forms. Young minds are like sponges, ready to soak in any information given to them. Hence, it becomes our responsibility to give them right exposure. What can be better than this kind of session where the author of such a thought-provoking book is one amongst the esteemed panelists? Education, as I understand, is not merely an information stored in the brains of the students and stays there unused, unutilized for the rest of their life. There has to be life-making, character-making assimilation of ideas. Think about a room with various instruments like dholak, tabla, sarangi, sitar, guitar, harmonium, etc. And each instrument is being played by an expert with the best composition in its own way. What will happen to the room? एक रूम में तबला भी बज रहा है, हारमोनियम भी बज रहा है, सारंगी भी बज रही है और सब उनके एक्सपर्ट्स अपनी अपनी ताल पे उसको बजा रहे हैं. Of course, there will be lots of noise and you'll have a headache. Then comes a musician to synchronize all these players playing various instruments. This will turn this noise into a wonderful, soothing melody. This magical turn of noise to music, problem to solution, and confusion to clarity is so very significant. This is what we aim while organizing such events. Collaborative academic activities are important component of our new education policy and other vital policies of UGC and NAC. The collective and interdisciplinary knowledge creation and dissemination plays a crucial role. I wholeheartedly appreciate the collaborative effort of the Department of Political Science with the Foundation for Creative Social Research, who have joined hands to encourage meaningful academic interactions. I believe today's discussion will help students in understanding the cause of violence as well as the essence and requirement of non-violence towards building a united society. I look forward to a very engaging dialogue which will widen the frontier of knowledge for our students and faculty. I wish a grand success to this virtual book review session and once again welcome you all. Now I would request Dr. Manisha Roy, TIC of the department, to take over the proceedings. Thank you.
But a reader finishes it. Good morning. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, Carnegie College, I warmly welcome you to Beyond the Book. Today, we are gathered here to deliberate upon a very exciting, a very interesting, and very lucidly written and thought-provoking book, which has been published recently. The title of the book is Violence in Our Bones, Mapping the Deadly Fault Lines Within Indian Society. The author is Professor Neeraj Chandok. This book deals with a very complex subject of political violence. The author seeks to probe a rather disturbing and profound question. Despite being the land of Buddha, Ashoka, and Gandhi, do we, the people of India, have violence in our bones? We are honored to have the author of the book amongst us. Professor Chandok is a prolific writer, author, and commentator. She's the former head of Department Political Science, University of Delhi. Presently, she is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Equity Studies. She has written and edited several books. Her latest work is Rethinking Pluralism, Secularism, and Tolerance, Anxieties of Coexistence. We have a formidable panel of eminent scholars who will be reflecting upon her book and engaging in a dialogue with her. The purpose of this endeavor is to widen the ambit of the discourses on violence in a democratic society like ours. We must examine why Indian democracy, founded on the principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and rule of law, has not been able to contain violent incidents. A deductive understanding of democracy as electoral wins or losses has been a key factor in the prevalence of violence. Today, violence is endorsed in the name of religion, region, caste, gender. All forms of violence need to be critically examined to expose the deep-rooted fault lines in India's sociopolity. In this book, Professor Chandok examines 6 major forms of violence, beginning with the partition and communal violence, violence engendered by caste discrimination, violence in Kashmir, violence in the Northeast, and Maoist violence in central and eastern India. She argues that despite the impressive performance of democracy, upholding the ethos and values of constitutionality, violence in India continues to be an inextricable part of everyday life. She believes that we need to go back to Gandhi and Gandhian principles of truth and nonviolence to find a way out of the senseless violence that engulfs and often overwhelms our country. The discussion will be initiated by Dr. M. Thakur, Associate Professor, CPS JNU, and Chairperson, Foundation of Creative Social Research. Dr. Thakur is a well-known political scientist and a writer and columnist. His publications are ranging from Indian philosophy, psychoanalysis, and literature and politics. Previously, Dr. Thakur has worked with Delhi University for almost 2 decades, and he was Deputy Director, Developing Countries and Research Center. Without wasting any more time and without any further ado, I hand over the proceedings to our union president, Aditi. Aditi, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aditi, and I'm the president of the Students' Union, Department of Political Science. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists for today's discussion, I would like to take a moment and extend a warm welcome on behalf of the student body to Professor Chandok. Thank you, ma'am, for taking out time from your busy schedule. Without further ado, let me briefly introduce the esteemed panelists for the extremely relevant and important discussion. Our first speaker is Professor Savita Singh. She's currently working with the School of Gender and Development Studies at Indira Gandhi National Open University, where she coordinates the PhD and Master's program in Gender and Development Studies. Her areas of academic interest are feminist theory, epistemology, aesthetics and gender, and labor. Professor Singh has also published excellent work in the field of political theory and creative writing. for which she has been felicitated with a number of prestigious awards and fellowships. The second speaker is Professor Arvind Kumar Mishra. He specializes in social psychology and is currently working with the Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. In his illustrious teaching career, Professor Mishra has also published a number of valuable research papers and books. Next speaker is Professor Ashutosh Kumar. He is currently serving as the chairperson of the Department of Political Science, Punjab University. Professor Kumar has a number of academic distinctions to his credit, and he's also served in various capacities in positions of academic leadership. Some of his published works include Electoral Dynamics of the Indian States, Globalization, and Politics of Identity in India. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Dhananjay Rai, who is the assistant professor and coordinator of the MA program in social work at Central University, Gujarat. His areas of interest and specialization include political theory and Gandhian political philosophy, and has also published extensive work in the relevant field. We couldn't have asked for a better panel to reflect on this topic. A few important reminders before we dive into this discussion. Panelists are requested to take 10 to 15 minutes to reflect on the book and share their thoughts and interpretations. They may ask a question to Professor Chandok if they wish to. Everyone else is requested to please keep their mics muted at all times in order to avoid any disturbances while the panelists are speaking. You can put your questions for the speakers in the chat box if you have any, and we will take them up towards the end. Now I will not take any more of your time and invite Professor Thakur for his opening remarks. Professor Thakur, the floor is all yours. Please go ahead, sir.
Aditi. Thank you, Department of Political Science, Gargi College, and Madam Principal for collaborating with Foundation for Creative Social Research. Purpose of Foundation for Creative Social Research is to create a discursive community which can pick up issues which are of contemporary relevance. In social sciences and literature, we are actually beyond disciplines. So our members belong to various disciplines and also outside academic world. And it's an interesting group emerging. And I'm sure in future we will have more collaborations in the making. I think since we have been a student of, many of us have been students of Professor Chandok, we have been knowing her work, and I can always claim that I've read most of the things that she has written. And we have learned social sciences through her. So reflecting on the book would be a very difficult exercise for all of us, I guess. But yet we have to do it in a very impersonal way. I think this book is a wonderful text in the tradition of moral theory. Yeah, we can show the book if you have. So this is a wonderful book in the field of moral theory and philosophy. I think the beauty of the book is that it blurs the boundary between theory and philosophy. And I think that is very necessary for any creative thinking. It uses the experiences of our own life, our own society, to philosophize and theorize violence and non-violence, and reflect upon the kind of crisis the Indian democracy is facing at the moment. I think this reflection also comes from a person who is probably the first generation after Indian independence, and by natural process is also owning the great project of Gandhi, Nehru, a kind of person of making India a great secular, socialist, democratic republic. And this is a kind of stress that is being reflected in the book when at this age he's realizing that this larger project is facing a crisis. And I think this is both hope and stress. So there is a kind of analysis of the problem, and there is a moral appeal. I mean, every chapter I read towards the end, there is a kind of appeal to the people that please get rid of this violence. And last chapter definitely is a text in hope. I think another point I've made somewhere else also that here is a profound social scientist, philosopher, political theorist, who is returning to literature to look at the resources available there. And that is a wonderful epistemological break I can see in Professor Chandok's writings. I think many of us have realized that the kind of engagement that literary people have with Indian reality, or reality in general, is a totalized ontology where human feelings are not separated from human reason. I'm sure Professor Savita would agree with me. And that is where actually we do the creative thinking also, not only creative writing, it is also creative thinking. And not only about our own life internally, but also externally. This internal and external, I think, meets in literature. That is what is reflected in this book also in a big way. And that is an invitation to social scientists of our generation and generation after us to deeply engage with our own literature, and not only literature of our own language, but we have to learn other languages of our own people to engage with them. I think it's a big invitation that she has extended to all of us. I will just make one new point, that is on her Gandhian solution to this violence that is happening. I think she has beautifully analyzed how Gandhi is so important for resolving the present crisis, the faith in dialogue, the trust in dialogue that we can resolve all crises through dialogue is something that she has demonstrated. I remember her article on dialogue and democracy in one of the volumes that I edited. I think there's one more point that I want to bring to her notice. That is, I'm wondering, out of 6 cases she has mentioned, one case, that is a caste violence, that is violence against caste. In most of the other cases, this is responsive violence. Those violence are also in a way response to the structural violence. But in case of caste, I always wonder why depressed castes did not resort to violence. I think that is where I find a clue that Gandhi has to offer to us. That is that in this case, probably, there is a guilt installed in the perpetrator of violence. That is what Gandhi was trying to do with the colonial power also. If the ruling class accepts that there is something wrong with the ruling class, probably that is the moment when this non-violence method gets deep root. I think that is one of the points that I would like her to consider. Another small point, she says that the roots of the violence in India probably lies in the modern nation state. I would like to her to reflect also if the roots actually lies in the philosophy of modernity itself. I know Dhananjay will not agree with me, he's already smiling. And I don't know if Professor Chandok will agree with that either. But I think Gandhian critique of modernity, I'm not saying that all the gains of modernity are not useful. I'm only putting a point that probably like Gandhi, we have to look into the ideological, theoretical, philosophical structure of modernity. Modern nation state is a product of that, no doubt about it. And also capitalism probably has deep linkage with modernity. And that is where the philosophical roots of violence actually lies. And if you look at the contemporary violence in the name of religion, a lot of people have argued that it is actually the modern version of religion that is resorting to violence. That is what Gandhian argument also, I guess, and Nandi does it very well. In fact, Nandi's project on understanding violence, which I'm sure Arvind will reflect upon as he's a psychologist, is very interesting in this sense that he's trying to see whether somebody who committed violence has any guilt about it or not. How does the person justify the violence? He does it in the case of partisan. A lot of cases he's trying to study. I think this is where I want to draw our attention that if we have to think of alternative modernity or we have to drop modernity at all, I'm not sure of it. But if there is a possibility of examining that case, That would be really very good. I think we are heading towards a wonderful discussion on the book, and this will be remarkable because I see a different kind of panelists. One Marxist teaching Gandhi, one critical realist, Marxist, and poet, another psychoanalyst and psychologist. So all kinds of people are there. It's a very, very nice panel I can see, and I'm sure it will bring a lot of interesting issues for us and for Chandok. Thank you very much. Thank you for the collaboration again. I'm looking forward to this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Madam Principal. Thank you, Manisha.
Thank you so much, Professor Thakur. Professor Chandok, Professor Thakur makes certain points about, the reflection on the book. Would you like to comment on that?
To immediately respond, what is the last part of your question? Would you like to?
The modernity, the project of modernity itself
Yeah.
modernizing state.
I appreciate the point, Manindra. It's not to say that violence was not a part of the body politic pre-modernity. I remember, and I think I mentioned this earlier, a very powerful play by the Manipuri director Ratan Thiam. It's called Uttara Priyadarshi, which is about the later days of Ashoka. Now, Ashoka comes, and Ratan Thiam's genius is creating very bare sets. He's a minimalist, so there's nothing on the set. Ashoka comes back from the Battle of Kalinga, expecting to be feted and be celebrated. But there is no celebration. Instead, Thiam shows, and Thiam is very influenced by civil war in his own native Manipur. So this is a reflection of, this is a political reflection on what is happening to his beloved Manipur. So he shows war widows, just a horde of war widows coming out from the wings of the stage. Then there are ghosts of soldiers who have been killed. They surround Ashoka. They wrap him in red banners. So Ratan Thiam's metaphor for blood is just meters and meters of red satin, which are placed around a revolving stage. And Ashoka takes time to come to terms with his own, what he has done in Kalinga. I mean, he has killed hundreds of young men. And by the end of it, he is given wisdom by a Buddhist monk, by a bhikshu, who tells him that, understand, violence is within you. It is not in the body politic. Come to terms with the evil in your own heart. And then the Ashoka's transition to Buddhism. So in a way, it's not as if violence was not. I mean, the Mahabharata was probably the most violent war in 13 days. They killed out entire generations. What happens that in modernity, two institutions, I think, make violence, normalize violence in the body politic committed by ordinary men and women. The first is, and I hate to say it, but unmistakably the first communal riot in India occurred over representative government in the latter part of the 19th century, when representation was introduced in the local bodies. And the venue for violence was Maharashtra. And how the Hindu community goes to Tilak and says, Muslims are going to out-represent us in the local councils. And there is the major right. Sudhir Kakkad has, in fact, looked at it in his book, Colors of Violence. The second is the market. The market is such an amoral institution. It is so indifferent to the suffering of human beings that it actually allows you. But even then, the kind of violence we are seeing in India, and I'm referring to the recent brutalization of a young woman in East Delhi by other women. because they held her responsible for for their young son, for their young man committing suicide. And the way she was treated, it's medieval. It's not modern. It's not the way you treat, blackened her face, shaved off her hair, subjected her to assault. I mean, the mind boggles. Where has this violence come from? And we'll come back to it at the end of the discussion. But we have to consider whether a political climate created by a political elite dedicated to violence has not fostered this penetration of violence into our body politic. And finally, yesterday was Gandhi's martyrdom. And we have to reflect on whether Gandhi was killed by a man or killed by an ideology. And if we think about it as killed by an irony that a man who dedicated himself to ahimsa would be killed so brutally. And there was this painting that was on the social media yesterday, Gandhi's death. You almost felt like weeping. A man who had taught his fellow citizens to follow the path of ahimsa, being so brutally killed. It was an ideology. And if that was an ideology, how do we engage with it in contemporary India? In fact, we'll come back to all these issues later. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Savita Singh. Professor Singh, the floor is all yours. Please go ahead.
My gratitude to the principal of Gargi College, Manindranath Thakur, my colleague and friend and chairperson of the Creative Research Foundation, and to Professor Neera Chandok, whose excellent book is under discussion today. I thank her for writing this book, frankly speaking. You see, where Neera has just left by telling her or articulating the relevance of the book, the time, the context in which this book basically is inserted. It is very important that we reflect on the title itself, The Violence in Our Bones. I will be speaking from a theorist position. So if my arguments get a bit technical, please correct and please stop me. Probably Neera had in mind kind of a deeper argument that she wanted to make about violence as one of the one of the. Can I go on?
Mute yourself. Please mute yourself. And please maintain decorum. One of the panelists is speaking.
So the title itself reflects or brings to us as theorists a concern, a deep concern with how the concept needs to be re-articulated. Because violence is, as she in the first chapter, in the introduction itself, she talks about the minimalist violence and the maximalist violence. This distinction is very important. And I think that's where we think that the book should be placed to be for us to make sense of its coming, its relevance, and the way it has been placed. So the thing is that commonplace violence, violence that we have been normalized, as she said, and violence that is still still not making real sense to us. Its intensity, its level of harm, its readiness to be employed, these things must surprise us, must make us think more deeply. So I think the title tells us that this book is a reflection on the ontological condition of us being human beings who commit various grievous kinds of violence. And not to say that it is not influenced by the kind of violence that has been committed in this particular time in which we are living in India. There is a very telling paragraph in the first chapter itself, where she actually asks what it takes for somebody to actually contemplate committing violence or murder, and someone to actually kill a person. And I think she's pleading that it should not be normalized. A person who picks up an axe and kills another person is an extraordinary act still for us to be surprised about and to be concerned about. So the kind of lynching that we see today, the kind of murders and kind of rapes, for example, breaking the backbone of a victim who has been gang raped is not something just rape. The violence has been extended, it has been deepened. It is this that is the fault line, I think. So her contemplation about the level and depth of harm that is brought through violence to a fellow human being is the argument which makes this book a text on ethics, reflected through a continuous employment of grievous kind of violence for political gain, for political power. And it is not that there are no other ways of garnering political power or engendering or producing political power. In democratic polity, for example, the methods of acquiring power, legitimate power, is very much given. All the structures are there: election processes, the way the candidates are chosen, the parliament where these people go and become our representatives, the mode and decorum of discussion, and constitution itself. So there, it is not that we have not invented, and modernity, I'll come to it if I have time. Modernity is dialectical. Modernity is not unidirectional. And it has already been pointed out by critical theorists, as Maninder pointed out in the beginning about my position. I am a critical feminist theorist coming from critical realist background, critical theory background, and we are now uh, laying foundations, I should say, of creative critical theory. And we are all in it. Maninder, myself, Dhananjay, we are part of the same group, and we are reflecting continuously. A political theory which does not answer these important ethical issues, then it is barren. Then it is for the sake of doing political theory you do. So, someone who's writing a book on violence is also reflecting, which you can see in the last chapter of the book, reflecting on how to overcome and negate violence. It is preposterous as the level of violence that has been accentuated. To think, even in this time, what is the way for us to negate violence? And we must, no matter how much harm comes to us, we must not allow ourselves to be convinced by the ferocity of violence that can be employed by political powers. If I have a time, I will read you all a poem telling you that, you know, political life, poetic life, our cultural life is not so transient, it's not so short. It's a long process. Things are going to be accounted and they're going to be counted rather. They're not going to be left uncounted. And Neera does this in this book. The 4 or 5 chapters she has is a kind of relentless, scholarly. It's a relentless deepening of a scholarly reflection on violence. This book is a tremendous contribution to political theory, in my view. So she goes into India's partition, legacy of communal conflict, caste-based violence. I mean, I tell you many things, many incidents that she has brought in, did not know. I mean, we claim to know very many things, but yet we do not know how capable we are of declining as human beings, how quickly we buy our own fall and get into it. Then India's many insurgencies in Kashmir, the Northeast, a thousand armed rebellion, and Maoist violence. I mean, she has covered in a very comprehensive manner all kinds of violence. There's no one violence, no kind of violence. In the first chapter itself, I was I felt like really calling her up because she has taken up issues of women. You know, one of the ways through which you can accentuate violence and and make an appeal to people who want to commit violence is to commit violence against women. She's always an example of an easy target. She's always made an example in every society, not in capitalist patriarchy, but in other all patriarchies. You'll find that patriarchy rests on violent oppression of women, not only oppression. Even in capitalism, where there was a possibility for freedom for all and liberation, you find the oppression that has been brought against women and nature as violent as it can get, in killing, maiming, in destroying nature, in destroying women, their capacities to love, their capacity to be compassionate. And towards the end of the book, Neera actually goes close to Gandhi precisely from these very uh, feminine inklings, I should say, that perhaps we can overcome violence not by violence, just as Fanon has done, and she's done an excellent, that is excellent comparison she has made between Gandhi and Fanon. A lot of people have made it. Violence cannot cleanse you. Violence can only deracinate you. It can only fracture you. It can only make you less of you. That is for sure. So, to that extent, I accept her argument against Fanon. And to Gandhi, there are many, many shortcomings of Gandhi. Feminists have been very critical of him. But I will also concede this point here with Neera, that we have to find newer ways of responding to situations of violence in humanity and oppression. Gandhi found one in his own time. I can say that much. That his strategy, his thinking, uh, the way he interpreted our tradition, he he brought up those kinds of memories of texts and of sayings which were built on and based on compassion. You know, he went to Jainism, Buddhism, also some of the texts which he chose to use to reinterpret our discourses of modernity. They were very strategic and they were very useful, I could say. Gandhi may not be an answer to all kinds of violence and forever the violence that is going on. He may not be. But at one point of time in our history, in Indian history, he did show a way. He did lay certain bricks which we can bank on. All right. And towards the end, I must say that where this book uh, stops, I think a chapter which I will write, I think I'm so inspired by this book. Uh, that there are certain things there is not only root of violence embedded in us. There are also roots of what others have also said, and Roy Bhaskar, with whom I worked, is what is called unconditional love. Can we find that? Do we still have the capacity to forgive even this kind of lynching, this kind of violence that is being perpetrated, just to stop its cycle, just not to give it a further lease of life? Is it possible for us to reflect on building a compassionate society? I think the time for a liberal model of building a kind of fair and free society, it has lapsed in my view because of the overextension of capitalism and capitalist mode of production. Actually, I'm also working with Marcuse, so now I understand why repression became such an important factor for Marcuse and in his political theory when he began to think of liberation. Love, beauty, freedom, these are possibilities of human life, but they're repressed. And the repression is not only in terms of our actions, repression is at the level of instincts. That is very important to understand. Our capacity to even imagine that we could be loving beings, that we are capable of offering compassion, uh, to both perpetrators and victims of violence. That is the layer, that is the ontological depth to which we have to go, I think, in my view. And Nira has already almost come over there. I'm so very happy that she has written this book and she has made us reflect on on impossibility of living with this reality. We cannot live with it. It is an impossible situation. It has really has taken us to the precipice, as it is called. I mean, if we continue, then all of us will go down. Not only those who are suffering violence, but those who are committing violence will also go down, in my view. It is a level beyond toleration. This cannot be done because we have many resources of not being the way we are at the moment. We can always go back to our other resources and refashion and reconstruct our reality. After all, reality, to a very large extent, the reality that we know is constructed. We can go back to Kant and we can see, that we understand only things, we make the locks of which we have the keys. I mean, that is the limit of our human consciousness. Many things we cannot know. We can know things that we create or we spend time on deciphering and so on and so forth, and we already have keys. So this book is beyond liberal remedies, I would say, the remedies that liberal polity can offer, because this polity has been hijacked. It is almost under destruction. No, it will not make sense if we bring in Locke over here. Locke's treatise on toleration. It will not make, because they just mock this. Toleration is mocked. It is considered a prejudice. The rights that we give to our minorities and our commitment to secularism is considered false and hypocrisy. That kind of mocking, that kind of cynicism has entered into this polity. So perpetuating the old arguments may not work, but other arguments can work, that I am trying to make, and Neera is trying to also extrapolate, that overcoming violence is something that we should be, in political theory, we should be, at least at this time within Indian context, we should be thinking about. This book makes us think about it. And towards the end, I will just read one poem to show you as to how we can have a sense of time and sense of reality which already takes us beyond it. We are already placed in a transcendent moment. That is very important to understand. We should not be victims, we should not be victimized. We should have a different sense of time and our polity. The poem is called, and it is a metaphor. Kavita is a metaphor. Poetry is a metaphor over here. Okay? कविता का जीवन, मुझसे भी जटिल जीवन जिएंगी मेरी कविताएं, सोई रहेंगी कोई 100 साल, कोई उससे भी ज्यादा, जागेंगी खोलेंगी आंखें जब कई कई वसंत आ और जा चुके होंगे, जाने कितनी ही बार खिल चुके होंगे रात रानी और गुलाब, कितनी ही बार उपकृत हो चुकी होगी पृथ्वी उनकी अलौकिक सुगंध से, कितने संबंध बन और बिगड़ चुके होंगे, आ चुके होंगे कितने ही राजा रानी, ध्वस्त हो चुके होंगे उनके राजपाट। इतने वर्षों बाद भी मेरी कविताएं अचंभित नहीं होंगी, तब भी उन्हें यह संसार अनुपम ही लगेगा अपनी क्रूरता में, तब भी वे ढूंढेंगी प्रेम और सहिष्णुता ही इस संसार में। थैंक यू। I stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Savita Singh. It was indeed a very insightful, I mean, the feminist perspective and everything else. Thank you so much for that. Professor Chandan, would you like to comment right now or towards the end of the discussion?
Unmute.
You need to unmute yourself.
I mean, I'll keep within the time limit because otherwise we'll just extend it. There are 2 points. Thank you, Savita, for that very generous reading of a book, which I myself was. I used to sometimes, I work in a library best. I've since I was a student. And I used to come out of the library, my knees were shaking. I mean, reading those what one human being can do to another, what one Indian can do to another. I remember telling my friend Irfan, I can't take it. And he said, just finish the book because kis pe likh rahe ho? I said, it's just awful. My only regret is I didn't have a full chapter on women. I should have. It so happened that I had to rush to complete the book. And 2 points that Savita made, I think, are of great consequence. The one is that modernity, we should not take it as a homogeneous concept. Modernity is plural, and modernity bred its own critics. I mean, modernity was a debate for every philosopher that presented modernity as the solution to all our problems. You had a Weber, you had a Marx, you had a Nietzsche, you even had the communitarians who tried to offset the individualism of modernity. So that is well taken. Thank you. Um, Secondly, I liked her comment that we have many resources for not being the kind of people that we have become, that the kind of people we are. And growing up I was very apologetic when a friend of mine who, how shall I put it, who happened to be born into a Muslim family, said to me, tell me something. I said, what? He said, how is it that for the past 7 years my Hindu friends have left me? And I really felt like apologizing. I mean, I said, well, I haven't left any of my friends. So, in a way, we have to reflect that what happened in the recent past, that we started being so openly hostile and openly abusive about our own fellow citizens. It is not as if this was not happening throughout after independence, and I've seen a great deal of that life. But it was never as public as it is today. I think UP elections bring out the worst in our politics. I can't believe the kind of headlines I'm reading. Now, when your leaders are talking like that, you just think it's a justifiable way of behaving. And in a way, the state of a country's politics depends upon the politics of your state. I mean, political science teaches us that there is no social discourse independent of your master discourse of politics. And that's one modern statement, if anybody can be, the whole notion of a master discourse. Can we be otherwise inculcate compassion when you have a leadership that brings forth a history that has to be acknowledged, that a history that doesn't have to be made the linchpin of electoral politics? I mean, that is the question we have to reflect upon. What is the role of power in this creation, in this transition of violence from something that is in our bones to the commission of violent acts? Thank you, Savita. And I loved your little poem at the end. I must read it to understand completely. Thank you. Thank you, Aditi.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Neera. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Arvind Mishra. The floor is all yours, sir.
Sorry, I didn't get it. Who's speaking?
Professor Arvind Mishra.
Oh, okay. I'll just.
Is this being recorded or not? I think it's a good session.
Yes, it is being recorded. Professor Arvind Mishra, if you can hear me, the floor is all yours.
Is he visible? I don't see him
Uh,
on my.
He is
he was there
visible.
in the morning.
He's there. He's there.
Yeah, he's there.
I assume, ma'am, that he might have some connectivity issues.
Yeah, maybe we should move on to the other speaker. We lose
Yes.
time otherwise. Yeah, and then he can come back.
I think, yeah, I think we can ask Professor Dhananjay Rai. I can see him. He's right there. So I think we should request Professor Dhananjay Rai to begin.
Okay, I can, but I think Asutosh is before me. If he's there,
Yes, so, Professor Tosh, are you here? So you can go ahead.
Professor Dhananjay, I think Professor Ashutosh has some connectivity issues. So I think we can continue with you, and once he joins us back, we can have him.
fine, no problem. Thank you so much, Agagi College and Principal Madam, for this opportunity to speak on very relevant and pertinent book of our time, Violence, the Violence in Our Bones, Mapping the Deadly Fault Lines Within Indian Society. And I think this is an important text for two reasons: that epistemological advancement and quest for engagement. So these are the books. These are the two important features which would make this book very important, because you find in some of the books epistemological advancement, but pursuit towards engagement is hardly visible. So this book actually pleads for both epistemological advancement towards violence and also engagement. And the first, I have divided my comments into 6 sections and chapter wise. And the constitution of violence is important. At the conceptual level, constitution of violence is very important in the book, that is reflected in introductory in the introductions. And Professor Chandok says that ambiguity persists as to presence of violence in our bone. I mean, she's not saying that the violence in our bones, but ambiguity persists as to presence of violence in our bone. And there's no clear answer for this due to the complexity of human beings. However, certain clarity must be required for comprehension of violence. Impulse to violence and act of violence are to be differentiated. For unraveling the transition to discern catalyst that is located or provided by the ideological system like race, caste, communalism, patriarchy, homophobia, ethnic rivalry are other significant stimuli, but race, caste, and communalism are very important ideology in the book. And she argues that one needs to understand why the concept of they, for ideological performance and controlling for violent act. Violence may be random, spontaneous, or organized. In the age of violence, silence is acquiescence. This is a very important point as reflected in the book. Ancient is also important for a slew of signposts of non-violence. Therefore, it should have been recognized as an important creed of Indian civilization. Gender violence is writ large, which is backed by culture of silence. Government inaction is a tacit support to patriarchy. Lack of representation in decision making is a constant concern. Vicious and perverse stereotyping and harm infliction to diminished in the public eye are two risks for women. Democracy and violence must be understood congruently. Universal adult franchise has a transformative impact. It also considers with the presence of violence in form of non-state actors and the state actors or communities per se. She argues that violence does not hurt the powerful. Violence harms ordinary people. In a democratic format, violence as a means is not fruitful. Democracy and violence do appear contradictory but do exist in the context of India and elsewhere. International indices are not encouragement for functioning of Indian democracy, despite this is the sign of the state of affairs of Indian democracy in contemporary time. Despite violence may not be part of our bones, it may produce disastrous consequences. As he argues that, quote, violence is not the root problem. It is a symbol of a democratic deficit, of unrepresentative and unresponsive democracies, of injustice, of the failure of the state to control dominant group, and of the readiness of the state to use violence against its own people, unquote. Conceptually, violence needs to be defined for the concrete analysis. The maximalist take on violence does not help much. The conceptualization of structural violence is part of this category. It is imprecise and vague due to not definitional of violence. One of the lacuna in the structural violence is not recognition of intention as essential to violence. Quote, when it comes to the state and its personnel, the detachment of harm from intention and responsibility bears serious implications. State officials are practically liberated from complicity and thereby responsibility, unquote. But, quote again, but structural violence underplays crucial factor of intention, responsibility, and agency, unquote. The discrete virtue of a minimalist theory of violence is preferred and required, according to Professor Chandu. The vagueness of violence is resolved here through defining by bringing intentional and harm together, calling intentional harm. Intentional harm brings back the focus on voluntary action, choice of action, and moral responsibility. Quote, the belief that intention defines violence presumes voluntary action insofar as I had a choice between doing or not doing harm. I or you, the state or non-state actor, choose do harm. And this makes each of us morally responsible. Central to the concept of violence is intention. Violence and injustice are wrongs in different ways. This is the first part I see very important in terms of defining the violence. And a resource of the study is a very interesting, and this can be titled as a resource of the study. The book is the important source for eclectic approach of combining social sciences and literature. Definitional aspects are taken care by lingua of social sciences. The emphasis on conceptual clarity begins the undeniability of social sciences. The place of feeling pain, anxiety, disgust, and remorse is filled by poets and literati. This is a powerful use of explanation and understanding. For defining and unraveling of violence, rigor of social sciences is cogent, coherent, and coterminous realm. For understanding of outcome of violence, due to sheer intangibility and possession of non-empirical language, poetry and literature become fellow traveler in this journey. The first chapter is Indian partisan, and I think that this is an important chapter, which can be called partisan as a governmentalization. And this is a very important chapter. Unlike pre-modern state, British colonialism attempted to control Indian past by interpretation and future by thinking. Education and knowledge control were important for interpretation and thinking. Indian laws and scriptures were read as per the cultural and intellectual domination. And homogenization and standardization of law texts religious were common recourse for finality of the definite meaning of metaphysical, upper caste, Sanskritized, and the abstract. The second chapter is the legacy of communal conflict can be called as a legacy as continuum. And see, debates between instrumentalist school and primordialism, and she critiques instrumentalist school in that manner. And she says that religion is important and religion has also been used as a resource. She makes a conceptual difference between religion and the politicized religion. And she says that it becomes very important to understand intention to obliterate the space. And she reminds us and to the res publica that there are two contracts, government and the constitution and people to understand the legacy of communal conflict. Third chapter is caste based violence, and this is a very important chapter which can be defined as the undemocratic everydayness discussed in the context of Dalits who suffer, according to Professor Chandok, three important realms: extreme economic deprivation, institutionalized humiliation, and a lack of voice of participation. This is important to remind that use of Vedic tradition by nationalist leader without realizing its consolidation as Brahminical superiority and caste system had done enormous injustice to fight against the caste system. She says that we had rejected the diversity and dissenting traditions in Indian philosophy, and therefore we have a Brahmanical superiority and caste system. And she says that we have violence against Dalits, that these violence are unthinkable, terrible, and trivial violence. She says that collective memory, resentment, and resistance are important trajectories in this regard. Private spaces are more discriminatory for Dalits than the public spaces. That is the requirement of the active and welfare state. Fourth chapter and fifth chapters are very important, and they are on India's many insurgencies in Kashmir and the Northeast, a thousand armed rebellion. And these two chapters are very important to highlight democratic deficit in the context of India. And democratic deficits are since beginning with the constant modification. She also reminds that violence begets violence, or violence produces only violence. So you'll find critical assessment of both state and non-state actor. Chapter 6 is on Maoist violence, and this can be termed as a violence as undemocratic method. She reminds us of six things: that how far it is possible to use violence against democratic government. Second, armed might of the state is a significant development of late. Third, you have lots of government-led infrastructural development. Fourth, social welfare along with the coercion by Maoists are another development which needs analysis. And fifth, there are lots of similarity between Maoist and government concerning welfare scheme like Manrega and all other things. And sixth, violence without political mobilization is a fruitless exercise. If you have violence without political mobilization, you are abdicating responsibility of politics. And she also suggests that violence is unequal to justice, and phenomenon of violence without politics is the development in the context of Maoist violence. The chapters, the last part, conclusion, the case against violence is important, which can be said that by way of Gandhi. Here Gandhi is against violence because violence is not pragmatic, not productive. Violence is against truth, and violence is against the principle of non-dualism. That is, acting against other is also acting against you. Again, the maxim that we should treat others the way we want others to treat us. Gandhi offers, according to Professor Chandok, what we do to others, we also do to ourselves. This book defends the case of non-violence, not without the questioning of probables of violence. This book is important because violence is not negation of negation, but also negative dialectics. This has to be understood. Violence is has to be rejected because violence is imminent. It is all around us. Violence is also has to be rejected because violence is immanent. Violence has to be rejected because violence is anti-democratic. Violence has to be rejected because violence is anti-people. These are the very important suggestions, and I think two further questions I have, and I think that may be not answered, but these are there. I think intentional harm is an important contribution of the book. This is a very important contribution of the book. It rejects fait accompli, which is writ large in structural theory of violence. I think this is my take that it must be extended to social justice, patriarchal performativity, and capitalism. I think if we say that doing social justice, injustice, patriarchal performativity, and capitalism are also intentional harm, then what we can do that there we can fix the responsibility which is overdue. And this will also help to take recourse from Gandhi, wherein injustice also needs the elaboration of question of violence. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity to comment and read the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rai. I would request once again all the participants to please keep their mics muted at all times. Professor Chandok, would you like to answer anything that Dr. Rai was talking about?
Thank you, Dhananjay. Those very thoughtful reflections. I'll just respond to one point you made about democracy and violence. You see, I was a little struck by the fact that I mean, if you look at it, India is in a state of constant simmering, what they call low intensity conflict. But yet it never seems to enter into our discussions of democracy, partly because democracy is identified with elections most of the time. Why isn't, for example, Kashmir an issue which should concern the whole notion of human rights or justice? So they're wending their own way, studies on democracy and studies on conflict studies without really intersecting. Now, can you assume uh, that democracy is able to solve all problems of the human condition? As was assumed, it'll secure, uh, you know, from a maximalist notion of democracy as having everything to do with human well-being to the minimalist notion that transfer of power between elites. A democracy doesn't really take into account violence, whereas the fact is that every democratic theorist in the West wrote against the background of immense racism. Whether it was, I remember um, the philosopher, British historian that Dr. Ambedkar referred to in the Constituent Assembly when he spoke of constitutional morality, George Grote. Now, George Grote, a British historian of the late 19th century, Enlightenment thinker, a Victorian, wrote 12 volumes on the history of Greece, in which he said Athens is the embodiment of constitutional morality. Now, the famous historian E.H. Carr, when he gave his lectures in the mid 20th century, called What is History, said only one thing. You look at Grote, he talks about Athens, and he doesn't mention that Athens was a slave owning society. I mean, this is what you do when you selectively take up facts. How can you look at democracy without looking at violence in the body politic and seeing it as uncomfortably realizing that they are not strangers to each other, that they are very much, and then it's not as if I'm saying democracy is inherently violent. My suggestion is that violence is there on the margins of every society. It is the task of a very wise government to keep it at bay, to keep it on the margins through adopting justice, rights, equality, whatever our constitution gives us. Because if violence is just waiting for a chance to come in and sweep us up, look what partition did. It swept up people who'd been living with each other for centuries into this maelstrom that the poet Gay said, Mirgi ka daura pad gaya. My country is under Punjab is under an epileptic fit. So, in a way, we have to take cognizance that where there is injustice, where there is unfreedom, where there is inequality, you're likely to have violence lurking on the margins and probably making its entry. So we have to relate democracy to violence in a way which sees that one of the goods that democracy must promote is to keep it on the margins. It requires tremendous imagination and generosity, but it must be done. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Dhananjay. They're very reflective comments. Dhananjay was one of my last batches of students when I taught in Delhi University. Very articulate, um, very enthusiastic about political science. Very good
Thank
to
you.
see you developing in this way. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next speaker is Professor Ashutosh Kumar. The floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes,
Yes,
yes, sir.
Ashutosh, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm in a difficult place. So, uh, okay. So, let me just reflect on the book very briefly. But at the outset, let me convey my regards to Professor Chendo. That,
Ashutosh, we can't see you. Put on
ma'am,
your video.
I'm in a park. So, okay, I just try
Okay.
to. I'm using my mobile. I mean, we are shifting house right now. The shifting is going on, ma'am. So that's why.
Okay,
Anyway,
not an
so
issue, not an issue. Yeah.
so I mean, so Ma'am has been a model for me. I mean, her work ethics and her uh, work culture. I mean, that has been a source of inspiration for all of us. I think generations of the students are really inspired by her. I would just very briefly reflect on the book and certain points which I noted also in my review. One is that she raises some questions which are very pertinent not only for India's democracy, but uh, liberal democracies everywhere. I mean, we talk about the modern republican democracy. So these are the questions which are very important because, as earlier speakers have been also raising this thing, that when we consider democracy and we consider the spirit and the substance of democracy, democracy as an idea, democracy as a process, it looks like that the violence should be, violence is not really, it should not have any place in the democratic space, because when we talk about democracy, we talk about the essence of democracy, the values, democratic values, which are based on individualistic and egalitarian values. Democracies are supposed to be dialogic democracy to avert a war that could consume the energies of both sides. Okay, so democracies enable individuals, democracies also enable the social groups also, and that is very pertinent for a country like India, where we have so many social groups, to express their views and interest through a process of deliberations, right? And so democracies are supposed to have a built-in institutional mechanism and practices. As we talked about, like I'm a student of Indian politics. So when I think about Indian Constitution, what strikes me that Indian Constitution not only recognizes the differences, it also accommodates the differences, and it also gives a kind of a representation to the differences. That way, that has been one of the factor which has really kept democracy going in India, despite all those obstacles which we had when we started our democratic career. So this is a kind of essence of democracy. There's the space for dialogue, a space for negotiation, a space for protest also. Yes. So that way, democracies are supposed to render unnecessary the use of violence as a means of politics of resistance. I think I remember Dr. Ambedkar, who, while speaking in the Constituent Assembly, he spoke about the constitutional morality. And he said that now India is independent and we have our own constitution, we have our own legal constitutional structure. So there's no use of going back to the days of agitation and all those movement politics. It's better, I mean, movement politics in that sense, where you defy the state, you defy the legal structure. So he basically considered that in a democracy, it would be sufficient to take recourse to democratic means, constitutional means, to redress one's own problem, whether the problem is of individual or problem is of groups. So would not be any place for any kind of violence. What Professor Chendo talks about, structural violence, which is invisible, or direct violence, which he also refers to the maximalist kind of violence. So the question which you find in the book, for those who have not read the book, the questions, the kind of questions which really struck me in the first chapter itself, he says that uh, democracy and violence, how do they manage to coexist? She says, not very happily, but not uneasily either. And that is true for Indian democracy also, as we have seen that, India was born in a space when there was a partition, and, you know, we were product of, I mean, as Professor Chandok always used to tell us, that she was a child of a independence, midnight children. So India was born when there was a violence all around. But we thought that once India became independent, India became democratic, we had our own foundational principles, which are based on equality, justice, and space for everyone, accommodation for all the diversities. We thought that democracy and violence, the violence would be something which would not be occurring in India. But what happened in India? Just 20 years or 10 years onwards, we started having our communal set of communal violence in India. So Hindu-Muslim divide, which is all India divide, has been very much accentuated even in independent India. The second question, so the first question is that how come democracy and violence manage to coexist? The second question she raises is that why do groups pick up weapons or support those who do so when they have the democratic right to question injustice and renegotiate justice? That is a question which is also very pertinent for Indian democracy. That why we find all over, and she refers to the Naxal groups and she refers to other groups also. They have been raising they have been taking recourse to violence. When they consider that they are being unjustly treated and they are not really being given the space to negotiate. So that's a second question, which is important question which we all should ask. Then third is that she says that why has India, since its partition, been witness to violence involving individuals, groups, and states, both in direct and physical, and also in the institutional structural form. So she makes a distinction between the physical form of violence, the direct form of violence, and the structural form of violence, which may not be, I mean, which may have some kind of legitimacy, some kind of acceptance, muted acceptance by the have-nots. So this is a question which also let me think about that when you refer to the Indian state, if there has been a violence which has been like, I'm thinking of like the Telangana movement when there was a violence, or there have been earlier also 1950s there was a violence in Bangalore when there was demand for Andhra. So a state has accepted, a state has tolerated violence when there is no threat to existential and existence of Indian state. Whenever you have the secessionist movement, and I'm referring to Kashmir or Northeast, Nagaland, Manipur, whenever there has been a challenge to the territorial integrity of Indian state has resorted to state violence, and that violence, the counter violence by the state has been much more vicious than the actual violence by the disgruntled groups. So that is something which we need to reflect on, that the kind of, I mean, I'm reminded of this concept that's Granville Austin, when he referred to this seamless web, he said that one of the major concern of the Indian state has been the territorial integrity or security. And if you read the Constitution of India, whether it's Article 19, or you are reminded of this first constitutional amendment act, which when there was a debate in the provisional parliament, there has been a lot of insistence on territorial integrity and what you call national integration, territorial integration. So territorial, Indian state has a very territorial sense. And there is a question which comes to my mind. When you refer to the states like Canada, the states like Britain, they allow referendum to take place. And there is no that kind of territorial anxiety. But in a country like India, the moment a group, even if it is just a kind of raging voice, not really resorting to violence, the state reacts very strongly against the people, those who raise the voice of secession, or even those who are into autonomist politics, or the what you call the maximalist notion of autonomy in a state like Kashmir. So this is another thing. So you find that this is also a point when we talk about democracy, we talk about like the ideals and the reality. So there is a kind of a dissonance between the democracy's ideals and reality in India. And that has been, unfortunately, becoming more and more visible in everyday life and also in the associational life of Indian people. And there, I think sometime, and I think uh, the question comes that is India's democracy deeply flawed? Because this is a question which comes to our mind when we read the book by ma'am, where she refers to the cases where the violence has taken place. And then you also think that all over the world, there has been a thought about the backsliding of India's democracy. So then like these are the uh, spaces where you find that democracy is not really working well on the ground. On the other hand, we keep on, I mean, if you read the books, you find that most of the people would keep on celebrating India's democracy as the largest democracy, how in a procedural form, in the formal form, Indian democracy has done so well. So there is another point that most probably we really give too much emphasis on electoral democracy. In fact, Sunil Thilani has also argued that how the whole notion of democracy in India has been reduced to its electoral politics or electoral democracy. So this is a question which is very important, that why we should celebrate democracy only in a procedural sense. Why shouldn't we see what is happening on the ground? So this is one point which I wanted to say. 75 years of India's independence, but still all those challenges which Professor Chando refers to in her book, uh, most of the challenges remain very much there, and especially this growing class-based, regional class-based inequalities and associated discrimination and marginality, which are really becoming more and more prominent and becoming more and more visible also. So structural form of violence is not no longer so invisible. They are becoming more and more visible over the period. And that's why this book is important, because it refers to the anger of the powerless people and how these people, these rightless people, are they are becoming instrument. They are being used, instigated to indulge in violence. And she reminds us, if you read the book, that the victims and often the perpetrators of the violence, they are mostly ordinary citizens. And whether you refer to a terrorist act or a sectarian riots or a mob lynching or a Naxal violence, both the perpetrators of the violence and the victims, both are ordinary people. And the people who are behind them, they may not be indulging in violence themselves, but they are the ringmasters. So that is something which really helps us in understanding the intricacies of this culture of violence, which is engulfing a democracy like India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar. Uh, Thank you so much for those interesting points about structural violence. I think that is one thing that we all need to talk about. Moving on, the final speaker for today is Professor Arvind Mishra. The floor is all yours, sir.
Am I audible now?
Aditi, would Neera ma'am like to respond to Ashutosh?
Yes, ma'am. Professor Chandu, I can't see you on the screen. Professor Chandu, would you like to respond to Professor Ashutosh's comments and whatever points he made? Am I audible?
Professor Chandok is not.
Okay, maybe she could respond to Ashutosh ji's comments at the end. He can now start with Arvind ji. Professor Arvind
Am I
Mishra.
audible now?
Yes, sir, you audible.
Yeah, thank you.
We request if you could be a little louder so that closer to the mic.
Professor Mishra, if you could be a little louder so that we can hear you.
Yesterday I was talking. I have always problem with this WebEx. Whenever I use Google or Zoom, I have no problem of this audio. But in WebEx, I don't know what happens in my system. I would try to speak louder, but I don't know how louder it would be. Is it okay? Because or is it still very slow?
We can hear you. Please go on.
Okay. Uh, I wish Professor Chandok would be here also because I can't see. Maybe she's connected.
She,
Uh,
she's joining back. There's some technical issue with her internet. She's going to join back.
okay. Okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank the Gargi College, especially Principal Ma'am, teacher in charge, Dr. Manisha, and dear students. Uh, Although Professor Chandok is not present or not connected, but I must thank her for writing this wonderful book. Uh, Although I'm the only person who is odd here, all others are political scientists. You are doing political science. Many of you are trained political scientists and teaching. I have no training in politics. Uh, so with this limitation, uh, I have to speak and I have to share my view. Basically, I'm a student of psychology. I teach psychology at JNU. So to me, this book is a treatise on human nature. Although it said that the violence in our bones, but uh, Professor Chandok has written in first chapter, tendency to violence cannot but be ambivalent. Quite often we talk about, and many psychologists, profound psychologists have written about violence. And they have said one thing that human beings have potential to be a saint and potential to be a monster. So, this, and she has very rightly used this word tendency to violence rather than our innateness of violence. In fact, there is nothing like human nature. There is nothing like universal human nature, and psychologists are like a witch, which psychologists are like a magician who can discover it or who can invent it. Psychologists, in fact, they invent human nature. They sell their version of human nature as universal human nature. That is problem with the discipline of. So if you have read some of the books on psychology and you get this impression that you know about human nature, it's not very correct picture about human nature is like a potential and can flourish in any direction, in manner, and it is environment in which human beings are brought up or they grow up that shape that whether that tendency would be to become a saint or to be a monster or mixture of that. Uh, Another comment which I also liked, she says that impulse to violence is a part of individual and collective psyche. Uh, there is nothing like individual psyche if I use slightly theoretical position. A human being is individual only at the time of birth. But once socialization starts, even 1 day old child does not remain an individual. Child is already part of society. So psyche is essentially collective and social. There is nothing like individual psyche. If we talk about individual psyche, it is a theoretical abstraction. It is not a substantial entity. And the process of growth of development of human self cannot take place without presence of or without collaborations of others. Usually it is parent, mother, other caretaker. So self and other distinctions are not very clear in the beginning. And this distinction is created through certain kind of ideology or other processes, and child starts developing created self, and that self is sometimes celebrated. And in different society, in different cultures, there is a check and balance. How much we should remain as individual and how much we should be part of the collectivity also. But in times of violence, what we find that one person, even if those other person uh, try to kill, try to injure, try to maim other person. So there is a collapse of sense of community. Human being who is essentially a part of community. What happens? Some kind of sanity, what we say, or person gets intoxicated, forgets momentarily that another person is part of himself or herself. Because self cannot develop without collaboration and without help of others. So what happens when others becomes not not part of self? By annihilating others, one thinks that one has fulfilled oneself or one has developed. That's one question that comes to my mind. Uh, he has also quoted French enlightened philosopher Voltaire, and says that truly whosoever is able to make you absurd, able to make you. I said in the beginning that human nature is like clay, and it can be molded in any shape. There is nothing like human nature. And now some social psychologists who work on violence and on politics, they use this expression that politicians are entrepreneurs of identity. Talk of identity nowadays quite often, and identity in the sense that identity is very, very essential. Yes, in some sense it is essential. Identity also taken as viewed as it is a given reality, which it is not. We talk of multiple identity, but again, it's a dilemma. When I was reading Amar Sen's book, Identity and Violence, in which he was arguing that we have multiple identity, then how come we emphasis on one identity at the expense of all other identities? In fact, it is our expectation. That expectation comes from enlightenment milieu, that human beings should be rational all the time, and human beings should have, mind should work like a calculator, that you have multiple identities and you should give equal weightage to all identities. It does not happen empirically. Empirically, what we find that one particular identity in one particular context becomes very, very important. So what is this identity? Why do we look for identity? Can we survive? Can we feel that we are fulfilled or we are a human being without having some kind of identity? This is very important question. So what would be that shape of identity? And multiple identity which we talk so positively about be a reality of human existence. We all say that we have multiple identities, but can we really own? Can we remain very, very comfortable with that? One important psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, he talks about, he used the word self, and he says that holistic self and totalitarian self. What is distinction between holistic self and totalitarian self, according to Erikson? That all constituents of identity, which we call multiple identity, uh, they are chaotic. It's not that can make a very coherent whole, but human beings' capacity to live with this chaotic whole is one sign of health. So a healthy person is one does not look for clear-cut coherence. There will be some kind of coherence, but human beings' capacity to live some kind of coherence or sometimes chaos, one indicator of. There was some question on modernity, although I have not read about it the way political scientists read about it. But uh, based on my reading and understanding of modernity, I would like to raise one question here to Professor Chando. I think it is a very important question. That sense of coherence which we have, from where does it come? Is there any epistemic basis for that? And there can be only one kind of epistemology, or there is possibility of different kind of epistemology. So person who comes from different kind of background, who is not modernized fully, or has resisted to become modernized, and he or she has also a sense of coherence about one's own self. And another person who has different kind of coherence of self because of different kind of epistemology, can there be communication between them? Because some of the source person have said that modernity is not homogeneous project. It is dialectical. It is not one-way traffic. But yes, modernity can have dialogue as long as the other party also talks in the language of modernity. But those who are not modernized and those who use different kind of language, can there be meaningful and respectful dialogue between the language of modernity and language of non-modernity? And as long as we do not address this question, I think we cannot address the root of violence. Uh, Another very profound remark, which I like in the first chapter, writes, history tells us that east of violence lurks on boundary and in the services of any society. It can enter the stage at proverbial drop of a hat. The trick is to ensure that beast remains confined to the mark. Now, this uh, I would, although no, no way I am connected to Hindutva movement, but I'm using one metaphor from Hindu mythology. Lord Shiva, who is also called Nilkant. And why is Nilkant? Because when churning of ocean took place and there was poison, Lord Shiva, rather than throwing it out, and he swallowed it. And, and that's why his neck is blue. And for him, in every society, some amount of evil tendency. When we try to otherize people because person has some kind of evil, it's tendency to throw something away, to separate it. And we have another option that you adopt it, try to contain it. Not try to contain violence by throwing it out or by not recognizing it as part of ourselves, but making it part of ourselves, owning it. And these two options we have. I think modernity has taken or adopted first option by throwing it out, by cutting it out, not adopting it, not by owning it. There has been discussion on democracy. As I said that I am not a student of political science, so I have no formal training, formal reading of democracy. But as a normal citizen, there is too much emphasis, which other speakers have also talked about, that there is discussion on formal democracy. And we all try to be formally formally correct, politically correct. When we try to be politically correct formally, because there are certain truths, bitter truths we do not want to accept or we do not want to articulate because we know that it is very, very difficult. That's why we want to be politically correct. Formal democracy is also a kind of being politically correct. As long as procedurally you are correct, you are not bothered about do we have substantive democracy? And can there be substantive democracy? We do not try to address question or issue of human nature. So any theory of politics, theory of democracy, whether it is formal or other kind of democracy, has to address the question of human nature. I know this topic violence is very, very complex, which Professor Chandok has acknowledged very in a scholarly manner. In one book, it cannot be captured. Uh, there is another concept which many people, scholars have talked about, which I did not see in this book. Maybe I have written there, epistemic violence, because we all use our sense, our faculty to know our reality. And we have certain kind of epistemology, or either we are formally trained in some kind of epistemology, or we have acquired by virtue of being member of a society. We know that every epistemology has some kind of limitation, and modernity is also based on some kind of epistemology. Is epistemology of modernity reflexive enough? Can it own, or can it acknowledge its own limitation? Because we also know that by using modern language, by using modern category, modern kind of knowledge system, colonialists have done and others have been doing it constantly. Not give respect to other kind of knowledge system with which people live. Nowadays, we talk of education and failure of education system, but there can be a different way to understand failure of education system. That it is a resistance on the part of people not to get educated in the formal sense. But education system itself is very, very violent. And there has been study the education. And I will use just one concept of psychology, which we call self-efficacy belief. They believe that a person thinks that one is capable of achieving academic level at certain extent. And it is psychologists say that self-efficacy belief is very important for achievement in any domain of life. Children from marginalized community and non-marginalized community have equal level of self-efficacy belief before they go to. But once they are inside the school,
I'm
after just 1 year, after 1 year, it has been found that children who come from marginalized community, their self-efficacy belief goes down. School, educational institution, which we think is a very pious place, and which contribute to development of human being, is not necessarily true. In the case of children coming from marginalized community, it proves to be a very, very violent institution. So,
really sorry to interrupt you, Professor Mishra. So could you please make your concluding remarks? We are running a
yeah,
little short.
so I will take just one. Another thing I will say is that although phenomenon of violence is not very new to human society, but form of violence and persons' sensitivity towards violence has been changing. A new category of violence that is very, very prevalent in modern times is the impersonal violence. The violence which is perpetrated through many technologies. People will talk of in the name of science, development, education, violence has been perpetrated. Uh, Traditional belief systems have been violated. Traditional belief systems have been declared as not worthy of surviving. So if we do not address this kind of violence, can we address violence in its entirety? And at last, I would say that, and it is a dilemma, I have no answer to that. So I would be very happy if Professor Chandok can reflect on that. I know that for the development of a healthy self, human self, community, what modernity has done, because of modernity, now we don't have community. We have society without community. But there is a problem the same community is very, very essential for development of healthy human cell also becomes source of conformity. And that conformity sometimes makes us to become very, very uncritical. And by becoming uncritical, we eulogize some kind of identity, and that identity becomes source.
Thank you so much, sir. Professor Chandok, your final remarks and the response to Professor Ashutosh Kumar and Professor Arvind Mishra. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. Actually, my computer, it just got disconnected. So I'm talking to you from my phone, uh, which is not a very easy thing to do. Um, Thank you. I think both the set of comments were extremely informative, and I actually have very little to add to them, except that the comment made by Arvind Mishra about talking to little children about the need to practice restraint in their daily activities would probably help in averting this natural instinct to violence, which most of us seem to have embedded in our bones. The two distinct, you see, the normal explanation for violence between communities is either primordial or it is completely instrumental. Either we are born to hate another community or we use communities to instill hate between communities in order to further, at least people in power do, to further their political ends. Now, it seems to me that nothing can be created out of nothing. So, if individuals do not have this propensity towards violence, you might not find it easy to excavate these hidden grievances and historical memories to catapult violence onto the public sphere. So, my suggestion would be that look, there is nobody who doesn't at some point of his or her life think about violence, but it doesn't really mean that you translate it into violent acts. Two communities might live in a back to back existence. One community may not interdine or intermarry with members of another community. It does not really mean that they go around killing each other. That transition from a potential violence to actual violent act needs a trigger. Now, that trigger can be either an ideology, and if you, I mean, everybody reads, I'm sure, everybody has read about these two or three young Dalit men who tried to mount a mare to go to their weddings. One succeeded because he had 60 policemen surrounding him. The other, this was in the Bundi district of Rajasthan. In the second case in Madhya Pradesh, Sagar district, young man got into the mare, and then while the wedding procession left, upper caste came and ransacked his house. Now, this is the ideology that a community is considered somehow outside the pale of customs and traditions and beliefs that upper caste ritually practice. Nobody probably told them, go and this is just the outrage that you're supposed to know your place. And it is at this level that I think violence is very, very difficult to negotiate, to manage. Many of us from my generation onwards took care to see that our sons were taught the virtues of respecting women, or rather feminism. But men just think it's normal to abuse women's bodies, to subject them to disparaging remarks, to pass humiliating comments in the public realm, and anything that diminishes your dignity is an act of violence because it impairs you. I mean, Alex Honneth in his book The Grammar of Recognition says that the impact of disrespectful speech or hate speech is the same as the impact of rape. or murder or injuries. It inflicts a bodily blow. It does terrible things to your psyche, to your confidence. And we all know how young women, or even older women, subjected to sexist comments can feel diminished. Now, this is I mean, there's just this natural ideology that men have the right to do with women as they want. And I've heard very, very educated men making these disparaging comments, and you're left completely dumbstruck. I mean, how can anybody who's sensitive of the need for dignity make these kind of women gossip, or housewives make good administrators? I mean, I've heard this all my life. I hope the younger generation is more sensitive, but I fear not. Now, these kind of ideologies are difficult and they need sustained mobilization. They need, I think, tackling with a great deal of care, tackling this malaise with a great deal of care. And finally, I'll end. You know, this Nirbhaya rape in 2012, which was an instance of unmentionable, indescribable brutality inflicted upon the body of a young woman by a juvenile among the four men. A BBC reporter made a story on this juvenile who since then has attained maturity 3 years ago. I've referred to it in the book. And she interviewed him, and you know what his response was? Why was that young girl out in late, it was late evening. Women should stay at home, they should cook. She has no business being out with another young man. Now, you see that toxic ideology. And I don't wish you to mistake me. Ideologies come in packets, in packages. The ideology of female subordination is generally connected to ideology of general subordination of either certain communities or of certain castes. Now we have to fight, and we have to fight very carefully that there is no reaction, because increased numbers of not only rapes but the brutalities that are inscribed upon the bodies of women who have been raped is beyond belief. I mean, this actually, maybe it's the first time it's being reported so openly. Maybe we didn't know about it. But you start wondering, is this a form of revenge? So these are, as Arvind said, these are very complex issues. The issue of violence is extremely complex. We can't even begin to touch the surface. I mean, this book is just touching some aspects of violence. I've left out personal incidents of violence, except in the case of women, which I didn't do justice to. I admit it. I should have had a fuller chapter on women. But think about it. A woman gets married, and the greatest threat to women's safety comes from her husband. These are all the reports that are coming to us, family and health reports. Now, what other perversity can women be subjected to? So all I will suggest is, thank you so much, all the commentators and everybody who contributed to these. I'm very, very flattered, very honored, and very humbled by these comments, because I think I need to do much more. We all need to do much more. And my gratitude to Gargi College, the Foundation for Creative Theory, and other friends who organized this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I believe I would be speaking for everyone when I say that each one of us, when we go back from this discussion, we've taken a lot, especially with regards to the nuanced and insightful perspective that each one of you have given with regards to democracy
Thank you.
and violence. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank
Uh,
you.
we will be moving towards a Q&A round. Some of our students have some questions. We would be
Yeah.
really grateful to answer them.
Yeah, sure.
Anusha, over to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. It has been really great interacting with the panelists and ma'am. I think the book discussion has been so far really interesting and enriching. But before we end, of course, there would be some students who would like to interact with not only ma'am, but the panelists too. So guys, the floor
Sure.
is open for questions. The participants can put their questions in the chat box and I'll call out your name, then you can maybe interact.
Please identify yourself And please let us know who are you, who's the question addressed to.
Yeah. Anusha, I think Aishwarya wanted to go first. I think Aishwarya can go ahead then.
Yeah, Aishwarya, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Aishwarya.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
You can start.
Okay, I'm back to the computer, so I'll come back. All right.
Go ahead, Ashwarya.
Yes. Thank you, Anusha. Good morning, ma'am. I am Aishwarya R, a first year BA Political Science honor student, and I deem it my honor to be speaking to you. Ma'am, I have a question related to the conclusion part of your book. In the conclusion, you have mentioned that we must adopt the path of ahimsa in our dealings with each other based on mutual respect and obligation towards fellow citizens. So, ma'am, I had this question that do you think that practicing ahimsa in true sense of term in day-to-day life is possible? Thank you.
Uh, should I answer, Aditi? Oh, do you want me to wait?
No, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You can go ahead.
You want
All
to,
right.
we
Thank
can
you.
take 3-4 questions also.
Thank you, Aishwarya. The
Excuse me, ma'am.
philosophy of himself.
Ma'am, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I think you are connected through another device, so we can hear your voice now.
Okay. Now it's okay. Yes, I was also connected on my phone, so it was echoing.
Yes, ma'am. I'm really sorry for that.
It Yes, no philosophy you have to understand, and you're students of political science, political theory, which is an core defining aspect of the subject. No theory is just self-justifying. I mean, you have to justify it with reference to some other philosophical theory, some other perception, but basically a philosophical tradition. Now, Gandhi situated his philosophy on ahimsa in a number of traditions, and Savita had pointed out Jainism, for instance. He was very powerfully affected by Jainism. But because, I tried to look at the political aspects of Gandhi's argument, and one thing that I've realized with great interest is that Gandhi writes his Hind Swaraj, which he says later is his answer to the Indian school of violence. Now, violence had been catapulted after the British treated Indians shamefully post the 1857 revolt. They treated them with utmost callousness, with utmost disrespect, bent to take revenge. And in fact, I came across Charles Dickens saying who was the greatest, he catapulted the greatest number of social reforms in England, saying these Hindus should be exterminated from the face of this earth. I've unfortunately lost the quote. I wanted to really publicize it. Now, in 1905, the partition of Bengal happened, and young Indians started believing that the only answer to British imperialism was violence. And Gandhi used to go to London and meet the revolutionaries there, most of whom were connected to India House. Incidentally, Savarkar was one of the members of the cabal at India House, and he exerted great influence on his younger contemporaries. And at that point of his life, Savarkar was extolling violence. So there was an act of violence, I won't go into it, at India House, where a young Indian called Madan Lal Dhingra picks up his gun and shoots at random the political aide to the Secretary of State. His name was Sir Curzon Wiley. Now, Gandhi, traveling back to South Africa on the ship, starts saying, "This is my answer to the Indian school of violence." And if you have looked at the Hind Swaraj, the first question is to the editor, Cannot India rid ourselves of imperialists by random acts of violence? And Gandhi says, do you not shudder to free India from assassination? Through assassination, I beg your pardon. Now you see the argument of Gandhi. He says, look, if you employ violence to get independence, your post-colonial elite is going to be stamped with the cloven hoof of violence. And he doesn't say it in so many words, but his implication is you cannot use violence as a tool, because you don't use violence, violence uses you. You can't get rid of it. It's like seeing this wonderful film. I don't know whether you have, any of you, but I would recommend you see now Apple TV. I didn't even know actually Apple TV gave such good movies till it came into my inbox. Macbeth. It's played by Denzel Washington, because now the Hollywood trend, or most filmmakers in the West, are using African Americans or to play heroes. He kills Duncan and then Banco, and you see his descent into madness. It is a gripping film, just 1.5 hours. I couldn't sleep that night because violence overtakes him. It just absorbs him into its coils. And then there is wholesale murder. In the end, he doesn't, of course. His descent into madness, or his wife's descent into madness, is simple. Its symbol is emblematic of the devastating influence that violence has. And this is Gandhi's main answer. I'm not even complicating it with very, very deeply philosophical answer. He said, violence is not our tool. You don't want a post-colonial elite who comes to power with their hands dipped in blood. You see, when a man becomes a leader of this country, you have to see his history or her history. Or if a woman becomes a leader, have they come to us with their hands dipped in blood? Nobody is free of their history. You have to remember it and then not expect too much of them. But the most important argument that Gandhi makes, he looks at Socrates, because as students of political theory, you've all read about Socrates. Socrates, Gandhi translated Plato's Apology, which is about the trial of Socrates, into Gujarati. And so he's familiar with what Socrates said through the words of Plato. Socrates is brought before the jury at Athens, and they ask him why he was corrupting young men and their morals by talking to them. He would stop and start talking to young people. And Socrates says a very interesting thing. He says, a friend of mine went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the goddess, who is the wisest man in Athens? And she said, Socrates. And Socrates told this jury, he said, I knew she was wrong because I'm not the wisest man. So I started talking to wise men, astronomers and physicists and, mathematicians and philosophers and dramatists. Athens had them all. And he said, at the end of it, I realized that actually I am wiser than them. At least I know I don't know. They don't even know they don't know. You see the impact. If you do not know, right? You do not have confidence that you know more than others. You cannot practice violence. Violence always born of the notion, I know they don't know. My religion is superior to them, or my ethnicity is superior to them. So in a way, this epistemological lack, what Bhikkhu Parekh calls epistemological lack, makes a very powerful ground for Gandhi's theory of ahimsa. Thirdly, very small point. Gandhi said, I practice Advaita. Advaita tells you the other person is a part of you. It's not the biblical injunction, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Advaita says, do unto others as you would do to yourself. Because when you harm others, you harm yourself. That is his theory of violence, of ahimsa, and it was written in a very specific context when young Indians, men and women, had taken up violence as a response to the colonial state. You notice after the 1910s, when the Congress becomes more militant, particularly with the adoption of Purna Swaraj in 1929, violence goes down in the body politic after Bhagat Singh. Yeah, sorry, I am taking too much time, but I thought I should talk about this aspect of ahimsa.
Yeah, it's totally right, ma'am, for you to talk about those things. It's important too.
I'm sorry, I
So
can't hear you.
shall we move to the next question?
Okay.
So the next question I'm gonna take up is Ahana. Ahana, would you like to unmute yourself and speak to Savita ma'am maybe? Because the question is respect
Okay,
to
next
her
question is
speech.
to Savita. Okay.
Yeah. Ahana, are you there?
Am I audible?
Hanji, you are audible.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I had a question that what is the role of protest in democracy? Is it leading to violence? And ma'am, if it is a key role of democracy, ma'am, then what is the role of student activism in student? What is the role of activism in student life?
This
This is for
question,
Savita, right?
all right.
Savita ji, that question is for you.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. I think it's a very relevant question, particularly the second part about students' protest. You see, what you saw within 3 4 years, what you have seen is students' protest being delegitimized through violence. We must start where we are standing. It is not this protest, students' protest has not been stopped through legal measures which are, which are a civilized way of being a citizen of a political polity. It is being delegitimized through preponderance violence by the state. You must always understand when you ask when you are asking questions like this, the newness of a situation. Then you'll have the insight to proceed further in that direction. You must ask why. Why? I mean, if the students are protesting without being violent, if they're just raising slogans, however, the slogans may be direct or something, like RSS ka ho nash and this and that, they went on. But they were not inflicting violence on any object of the society or state. They were slogans and they were protesting. So, who is legitimizing and who is delegitimizing? Uh, Ultimately, I think the one who shows more violence gets delegitimized in the eyes of the people and in the body of the polity, democratic polity. So, do not ever think that there is one solid, stable position from where you stand. You can ask questions. You must be in the throes of things. You must be standing over there where things are happening and sort of conceptualization is going on. Today, when we talk about India, we talk about Indian democracy, there are a number of ways through which people are talking about it. To the extent that some people are saying that we do not have democracy the way we thought democracy functions. At the level of function, there is no democratic ethos in it. The others who are saying that it has been turned into a procedural structure. That is all. You sort of go for certain kinds of rituals that are necessary for democracy to maintain itself. And the third position is a lot of people are saying that this democracy has been hijacked and it's like a cover under which you do everything else, which is not democratic. So I'm just putting forward a picture of our democracy from various angles, just as a photographer takes very many pictures of the same incident. All right. And then when you see it, when you see from multiple perspectives, you will find yourself having some answers yourself. I'm no one to give you an answer, but I can tell you that if we are talking about democracy that we built through struggle, through movements, through constitution, if that is the democracy we are talking about even today, and we don't think that it is a legitimate way of talking about in democracy, all right, then certainly students have a place to protest, workers have a right to protest, women have rights to protest, because all these things lead to change of policies, and policies to a very large extent also transform our polity. So we have to see which kind of policies are we making, in which way are we changing our polity, we are we which direction we are going. I mean, is there a way um, to ethically talk about democracy today, or is just the Chanakya policy is the most important thing in politics? Anything I mean, anything, um, the end justifies the means kind of a situation. Is that what we're going for? So for students, it's very important that uh, you should not become skeptical. Your ethical position must be invoked. Somebody asked a question about unconditional love. All right, I could not read it, that is too light. I want to connect it with this understanding. After all, uh, there are a whole lot of post human philosophies today. I don't want to introduce you all to that, it's too complex. But is it possible for us to to de-recognize ourselves as human beings, wipe out wipe out our memories of being human? Is it possible? If these things are possible, then probably we may not be asking these questions. Maybe there will be no position to protest in a democracy which will be a cyber democracy, which will be run by what is now feminists are calling catastrophe capitalism. Capitalism that progresses by endangering the earth, endangering nature, and endangering people who provide labor to build this big habitat that we have, which is earth. So there are many many questions. When we ask the old questions, like what is the role of protest, students protest today, we have to ask all these questions today. Otherwise we'll be quite disillusioned, I must say. You might be given a right to protest, and you may not be allowed to protest. That is the conflict that we are in today.
Savita ji, just a small question from me, and Professor Chandu can also address this. Do you think we're living in a state of exception, as Agamben said, where the
Yes.
rule of law is being transcended in the name of public good? And if that is the case, then what should we do? What should be our responsibility as citizens to counter that?
Well, the thing is that we have to find if we still love the way we used to be. Do you think we still love our democracy with multiplicities built into it, diversity accepted, unity defined in terms of diversity? Do we still love how we used to visit each other, no matter what religion we came from or what ethnicity? We greeted each other in during festivals. Uh, you know, Going to a Muslim family to congratulate them and facilitate with them Eid, for example. All right, they coming to our houses during Holi, for example. We have to think about all these things. We took them for granted, as if some sacrifices were not made to bring the situation in. Right, we must remember those sacrifices people did. We have to go back to freedom struggle, revisit it in the sense that we have in our memories, the senses that are there in our memories. So I think that we have to really make a sense. State of exception, Agamben is, I think, I really like him, because he theorizes what is actually apparent and what is happening. All right, the state is refusing to be anything other than uh, what neoliberalism is putting forward or putting on our table as its priorities. If a state does not have its own ethical autonomy, then uh, we have to really believe that we have entered into a situation which is a state of exception. And it's like exception is also kind of nihilism. This is the borderline. You must understand, nothing is valuable, all values devalue themselves. If that is the kind of situation, it's like a nightmare. So we have to choose if we want to be in a nightmare, or if we want to have our dreams still, to which we are connected, or we are still sort of hoping to dream about a society, a life where there is very little violence. I'm so afraid even to say that let's imagine a society where there is no violence, right? But minimal violence, even that is a difficult thing to think about it now.
Mahabharata was written to demonstrate to us the futility of violence.
Yeah, if you read J.L. Mehta's excellent article on violence in Mahabharata, you will understand why that particular grand text was written. I mean, Mahabharata is all about mistakes that people have made, particularly those in power, particularly those who were unjust, particularly those who were addicted to various kinds of vices, like gamblers. You see, one gamble takes place, and the entire human life comes under serious danger. If Draupadi was not given away uh, during the during that particular uh, gamble game, dice,
Chaucer.
yeah, if it wasn't, then there would be no Mahabharata. You see, so I think Mahabharata is a text which Gita, for example, part of it, a lot of it is in Gita, right? Why do you think Gandhi was reading Gita, rereading Gita? Why do you think Shanti Parva is such an important chapter of this text? Obviously, violence is destructive. Violence is quite destructive. And to what extent do you want to destruct to construct a better society? That is the decision we have to make as human beings. The violence should not engulf us. As I said earlier, that we are in a situation where all of us are going to go down now, because the ethical limits to violence is not recognized. Unmitigated violence is not something human society can take, I think. We can
We
agree
love
collectively, we can
hearing.
agree as to how much violence the society needs. There was one filmmaker who made a film on the Vietnam War. I'm forgetting his name. In one interview, he said that perhaps we will never be able to eliminate violence from human society as long as there would be a need for it. All right. So there would be a need for a prison, a house, even in a more flourished democracies. I do not know whether in a communist society we will have need for a prison house where violently people will be put under bars and behind bars. But yes, there is a balance that we need to maintain. We have to create. We have to ethically agree as to how much violence is allowed, and which way it is going to be employed. That is very important, and that is why we need democracy, because only democratically we can do these things in consensus, in public, not in private capacity. And
I
the state is
totally agree
nobody's
with
private
you, ma'am.
property. This Indian state is no one's private property. I mean, we have to say this.
Very true. So I guess, ma'am, we'll take the last question for today, and that is from Harman to Neera, ma'am. Harman, could you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, good afternoon, professors. My name is Harman Kaur, and my question is for Professor Neera Chandok. Professor, in India, marginalized communities like Dalits still face many atrocities, as you already mentioned in the book. Even though affirmative actions and laws try to bring proper representation and justice to these communities, still there are many loopholes that need to be addressed. Our society still continues to discriminate against a large section of these communities. My question is, how and when will this structural violence stop? Will the mindsets of people never change with regards to these marginalized communities?
Society has not kept pace with our constitution. And here I'll take you back to Ambedkar when he introduced the notion of constitutional morality. By constitutional morality, Ambedkar, drawing upon the notion as elaborated by George Grote, said that constitutional morality implies two virtues. One is freedom, the other is self restraint. It actually means that the state, the government should be restrained, and of course, society has also been to be impose restraints on itself, particularly when it comes to, I mean, he meant discontent, but also practicing why. But one thing that Ambedkar said, which was interesting, he said constitutional morality does not come easily to societies. It has to be inculcated by an elite that is devoted to the constitution. Now, when you have an elite which is basing its electoral calculations on caste, caste might diminish in social life, but I doubt how much it's diminished, but generally, yes, in an urban setting. Possibly one can hide one's caste. But as a political category, it has become even more explosive because it is the basis of votes. I mean, we hear this all the time, Jats against Muslims and Yadavs against non-Yadavs in UP, which is a breeding ground of caste. Now, these are the political entrepreneurs that might take up tensions which more enlightened people might put aside, though I doubt it, because when I started reading around caste, I realized that actually it's very much a part of our lives. It's very, very much a part of the way we structure our social relations. Someone just told me, just look at the matrimonial columns of our newspaper. Till today, it's not only caste but subcaste. So I want to really conclude this comment by by a short stanza of a poem written by the Urdu poet Sagar Khayyami. Now, actually, Urdu poetry today has become really revolutionary. It has lost its old romantic imaginations of not ever being united with the beloved. This is 2008. He says, ऐसी कोई मिसाल जमाने ने पाई हो, हिंदू के घर में आग खुदा ने लगाई हो, बस्ती किसी की राम ने यारों जलाई हो, नानक ने सिर्फ राह सिखों को दिखाई हो, रामो रहीम और नानक को ईशा तो नरम है, चमचों को देखिए तो पतीली से गरम है. Where in religion do you get the phenomena of gods burning houses or killing people? These are people who talk in the name of religion and practice unimagined brutalities. And I will repeat, I keep saying this, we must remember Voltaire. This is a bit of a disruption of Voltaire's own words. I was trying to look for them. But, great many sayings have been attributed to Voltaire. And one of the things he did say, if they can make you, a political elite, can make you believe absurdities, they can make you commit murder. Now, if you look at the absurdities in our body politic, the other day I wrote a piece saying, what on earth does libotard mean? I mean, what on earth does it mean? You are not only secularism, but secularists. I mean, क्या मतलब क्या है इसका? And in a way, to dismiss these notions because another kind of ideology is in power. Yesterday, a friend of mine, Sanjay Hegde, who's a lawyer, had a very impactful piece on social media. Gandhi is saying, follow in his footsteps, not in the footsteps of his assassins. Eschew the ideology that killed Gandhi. Now, in a way, when you have this kind of vulgarization of political language, then where are you landing up? All our certainties have been turned on their heads. We have to be careful of the absurdities our political elite deals in. Khan Market Gang. I mean, I wanted to actually, I didn't think I never did. I wanted to actually write to the Prime Minister and say, Mr. Prime Minister, why don't you join a group of us in Khan Market? We will buy books, we'll have a cup of coffee. That's all we do. Which other market will you find 3 bookshops in? You go there, we're going to buy books or sit with friends and talk over coffee. And within a week, my niece tells me, Boa, there was Smriti Irani shopping in one of the designer shops of Khan Market. She took out her camera to photograph her, but Smriti Irani's security guards didn't allow her. These are the people that go to designer shops. You and I, belonging to the university, can hardly afford those designers. We go to buy books. So, what is so subversive? Maybe reading books is subversive. That is also considered subversive. But keep up with your learning, keep up with your deep interest. And I'm and just to add to Savita's very interesting comment on student protest, in December 2019, the CAA had, the Citizenship Amendment Act had been passed in Parliament, and many of us were sitting holding our heads and says, who's going to protest? Our civil society has been rendered toothless. Many of civil society organizations have been denied funding. And then suddenly on the 15th of December, we saw Jamia Millia students marching through Friends Colony. And it was so heartening. It was so heartening to see young people come out all over the country against the CAA in a gesture of solidarity with their co-citizens, saying you cannot disenfranchise our own people. And what were they doing? Holding the constitution in one hand and carrying the national flag in the other. And in the background of Bhagat Singh, Ambedkar, and Gandhi, they read out the preamble. I have never seen the constitution being made so much a political weapon as it was in the student demonstrations. And finally, in February, 10,000 students of Delhi University marched in protest. Freezing rain. I mean, in Delhi can be so cold, as we all know these days. And I had tears in my eyes. I said, I'm so proud of our students. They have shown us a way which we thought did not exist. So keep it up. We are very proud of you because you are the guys who've raised their voices in solidarity with our co-citizens. And solidarity is a virtue that needs to be reinvented along with compassion and love, as Savita had said.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think we all
Somebody
agree
sent
with
me a
that.
heart. Thank you. There's a heart floating around the screen.
Many, many, many hearts,
Yeah.
ma'am.
I want this. I want students to sort of, never shy away from expressing your emotions. Nobody should stop you from feeling. That is
Yeah.
very important.
The three hearts, one. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, guys. This was touching. After a very long time, somebody's been sending me hearts. Symbol, rather.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. I think we as students and hearing these kind of words, encouraging words for student protest and student activism,
Oh,
especially
it was
gives people like
brilliant.
us strength in these bleak times. So thank you so much for that.
Actually, I'm doing a short book on the Constitution. It's been commissioned by a publisher. I start off with students' protest that this is what our Constitution is. It inspires us to. It's not a legal document alone. It is, of course, it's a lawyer's paradise. It's a political document, and the beginnings of this document are in the constitutional initiatives that began in 1895. When the first Bill of Rights was produced in a Constitution of India, Bill, this is our Constitution, this we have to protect. I'm very impressed by young people, the way they use the Constitution. I have never seen such creativity. So all I can say is thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Sadeshna, do you want to say something?
Yes, actually, before we end, we have had some amazing insights from all of y'all, and we'd probably like to connect with you over maybe email or your social media. It'll be great if you could share it with us. We'd love to connect with all of y'all. So if you could put it in the chat box, it'll be great. I just wanted to mention that before we wrap up because we are all highly inspired by all of you.
Join the Facebook. We are on the Facebook, most of them, most of us.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
As what? As individuals or as a group?
As an
Facebook?
individual. Yes.
In fact, I read most of Savitaji's poetry on Facebook only. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Facebook, as long as it is tolerating us, is fine. So
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Professor Chandok is also on Facebook.
I think I can manage Facebook. Others I can't. It's too much.
I think
You
uh,
know, once I just wrote a small piece for the Tribune saying, have you ever thought of what our minorities go through when they are told to prove their allegiance to India? I mean, these are people who chose to stay back. And I get all these terrible comments saying, say Allahu Akbar. What is your problem? I will say Allahu Akbar. If that's something, you go to a church, you pray, you pass a gurudwara, you pray. इसमें क्या problem क्या है तुम लोगों को? But this is a kind of uncivil. I mean, our social media has become the site of great incivility. It's very, very
Yeah.
painful.
It's very tough. Yeah. It's very tough.
Yeah, I mean, this
Yes. To be on
kind of comments. You shameless woman, one man tells me, what have I done? I'm not taking anybody's name. I've become careful. So in a way, this can become hazardous for your mental peace. But then I don't bother. I just delete them. It's just ridiculous.
maybe it was not a good suggestion. We should just connect by giving our emails.
so now we'll move towards the end. I would request
Janvi,
everyone to please switch on their camera so that we can click a picture.
I'm sorry, did somebody say something to me? No,
Yes,
somebody.
we all request to all the participants to switch on their cameras. We need to take a group picture.
Yes.
are we still
How
on?
do we do it?
Just be there as you are.
Who,
Just be on
the
the
other
stage.
participants
Sure.
who are, they need to switch on their videos.
Manisha, send it to the publisher. They'll be very happy. Okay?
Yeah, I actually want to thank the publisher for donating a copy of the book to Gargi College. Thank you. I've got a copy, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I would
Thank
request
you.
Jagriti to come
Yeah.
over.
Let's take a
Thank
picture
you.
with the books. Whoever has
Yeah,
it.
Also, if you all do not have the book, you all can put it on your phones if you want the picture of the book.
I'll have to pick up a copy from the back. Doesn't mind if I don't hold a copy of my own book. I've never been.
Yes, ma'am. We've taken the pictures. Jagriti, over to you.
Yeah. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
little louder, Jagriti. You have a very sweet voice. A little louder.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible now?
Yes.
As we mark the end of this discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone present here for their contribution on behalf of the Political Science Department, Gargi College. First and foremost, I would present my sincere gratitude to our principal, Professor Pramila Kumar, for facilitating this event. In addition, a huge thanks to Professor Neera Chando, for enlightening us about her wonderful book, The Violence in Our Bones. It was nothing but an absolute pleasure to hear you, ma'am, and also the little poetry you said at the end. Uh, it, our sincere thanks to our chair, Professor Manindranath Thakur, our panelists, Professor Savita Singh, Professor Ashutosh Kumar, Professor Arvind Mishra, Dr. Dhananjay Rai, sir, for their valuable contribution, without which the discussion couldn't have panned out the way it did. We are also grateful to our teacher in charge, Dr. Manisha Roy, and association in charges, Dr. Devraj Singh and Dr. Seema Sharma, for guiding us throughout the entire organizing process. To our faculty members for gracing the event with their presence, to Anuj Bhardwaj sir for taking care of the technical aspects of the event, to our enthusiastic participants who made the session lively and interactive with their emojis and also wonderful questions. It was truly an honor to collaborate with the Foundation for Social Creative Research and such eminent speakers. I'm sure that all of us are taking some lessons of wisdom home today. Lessons of ahimsa, lessons of peace, and lessons that are beyond the book. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. And on this very happy note, we will bring the entire session to an end. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Manisha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think it was a great discussion. Very nice. And thank you,
Lovely.
Neeraj, for writing this
Okay.
book.